This is Focal Point with Brian Fisher on AFR Talk.
Hi, and welcome back to Focal Point AFR Talk. You just heard the spot for the military Bible stick. We take 1 week a year where we work with the folks that provide these military Bible sticks to men and women in uniform. And we've got the best equipped military in the world, but a lot of our soldiers, thousands of them, are waiting for a crucial piece of spiritual equipment, and that is the military Bible stick. Now, we've got chaplains out there that are requesting these audio Bibles. They want them for soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. These soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, they've come to their chaplains and say, can you get me one of these military Bible sticks? So here's an opportunity for us to get the Word of God. And boy, when you talk about what's going on right now in the military, if there was ever a time when we needed to strengthen the Christian soldiers that we have in the military, the time is now, because they are going to be increasingly beleaguered in the military with the changes that are taking place. Now's the time to get this weapon in their hands. Now, this military Bible stick, it's an audio version of the Bible. It's small, it's portable, it's rugged, it's made to military specs, and it's not a whole lot bigger than a pack of gum, so it's very, very portable. It has a complete audio version of the New Testament in dramatized form. For $25, you can underwrite the cost of one of these military Bible sticks. So we want to emphasize that this week, encourage you to get on board with this program. You can go to militarybiblestick.com, or you can call 800-800-2555. Again, that number, 800-800-2555, or go to militarybiblestick.com. Now, one more soundbite from Robert Oscar Lopez. This is clip number 5. You know, and we had this Mark Regnerus study that came out from the University of Texas. And he interviewed adults who had grown up, at least for a part of their childhood, in same-sex environments. And he interviewed them now as adults looking back to evaluate their experience. And he discovered when you tabulate the impact, the negative impact on their lives of growing up in same-sex households, and you compare the outcomes in their lives to children that grew up in intact two-parent households where they were raised by a mom and a dad who were married to each other, the children in these same-sex households fared worse in 77 out of 80 possible outcomes. The rate of boys that grew up in these same-sex households of being abused sexually, 300% higher than normal, 300% higher than in heterosexual environments. And for girls, this was the staggering thing. For girls growing up in a same-sex environment, particularly raised by two lesbians, they reported, 23% of them reported unwanted sexual touching. The rate in heterosexual environments is 2%. Now, 2% is obviously 2% too many, but 23% is 10 or 11 times the rate of sexual abuse suffered by vulnerable young girls that are in these same-sex environments. This is obviously an unacceptable place for children to be placed. They never should be adopted into same-sex households if we care as a culture about vulnerable young children. And here Robert Oscar Lopez talks. Now, we know this. Instinctively, common sense tells us that. Scripture tells us. History tells us. Tradition tells us. Not a good idea to put children in an environment where they're raised by same-sex parents. And here Robert Oscar Lopez talks about the difficulty of getting this kind of research into circulation. Let's listen.
Between the early 90s and 2012, there was a noticeable silence of people. There seemed to be no data coming forth that showed negative impacts of same-sex parenting. We can look at that and say, okay, maybe it's because same-sex parenting is okay. No, but when you take a closer look, it's because there were hate speech codes at most of the universities that employed the researchers. People were very fearful of publishing any data that angered the gay lobby. If you look at what happened in 2012 when Mark Regnerus and Lauren Marks and other researchers came forward with data, it was an onslaught. They were brought up on hate speech charges. 200 sociologists banded together and opened an investigation to try to accuse him of malfeasance. and academic misconduct. All of those charges were disproved in the end. It was legitimate research. It was data that was solid because they recruited the adults who had been raised by same-sex couples. They weren't recruiting parents who had small children at home. And they measured a broad range of impacts, and it was over a long-term time frame. So if you look at all of that, essentially that consensus, all of the research that is cited by people who are promoting same-sex parenting must be thrown out.
So that's Robert Oscar Lopez. He's a guy that knows what he's talking about. He is a professor at a university in the state of California, grew up in a same-sex environment. And here is that piece I was talking about. We'll go to the phones here in just a moment, 888-589-8840. Here's a piece that was published on the Public Discourse on July 8, just a couple of days ago, by Robert Oscar Lopez. The heading of this piece, it's a lengthy piece, prints out to 6 pages, is same-sex parenting child abuse. He puts a question mark after it, so he's raising that question. Is same-sex parenting a form of child abuse? And I argue that it is. That's why no rational society that cares about children would ever deliberately create households where we're putting children in same-sex parenting environments. Now, here is what he says. When told by everyone in the vicinity that what's happening is normal and there is no cause to be aggrieved, or even worse, a reason to be grateful, the natural instinct of the child is to blame herself for revealing the effects of mistreatment, in addition to the primal trauma of the mistreatment itself. The situation is much worse if outsiders who intervene, such as doctors, school officials, cousins, or legal authorities, side with the guardians. So he says, look, there are actually 2 kinds of child abuse that happen in same-sex households. There is the trauma itself of a child growing up in that environment and whatever mistreatment, whatever deficiencies they experience in that environment. That's a form of trauma. That's a form of abuse right there. Then there is a second form of abuse when this child is ordered to accept the myth that this is normal, that this is healthy, and that they ought to be grateful. Because what's the child going to do? The child has these terribly conflicted feelings about what he's experiencing, what he's observing, and he is going to be told this is normal. In fact, you ought to be grateful for this. You're lucky to be raised by same-sex parents. So what does the child do when he experiences all of this internal pain? Well, he blames himself or blames herself. It must be my fault if all of the adults, all of the experts, all of the authorities in my world are telling me that this is perfectly healthy. If I think it's not, there must be something wrong with me. It's a second form of child abuse. And Lopez says both sides of the same-sex marriage debate are afraid of naming child abuse by same-sex couples. Even critics of same-sex parenting are scared to go there. And believe me, I know what he's talking about because I've been saying this for some time and just been absolutely pilloried by the left. So he says, look, people are intimidated. Even people who are critics of same-sex parenting, they will not talk about this as a form of child abuse because of the vitriol and the anger and the hatred that is released. Now, here's what he says. What I mean is this. Even the most heroic mother in the world can't father. So to intentionally deprive any child of her mother or her father, except in cases like divorce for grave reasons or the death of a parent, is itself a form of abuse. Now, this is Robert Oscar Lopez saying this. I simply agree with him. I'm going to repeat that. Even the most heroic mother in the world can't mother. So to intentionally deprive any child of her father or mother, except in cases like divorce for grave reasons or the death of a parent, is itself a form of abuse. This holds true not only for same-sex parenting, but for any choice to parent a child in a less than ideal setting for a less than grave reason. So he says, look, this is a form of child abuse, and it's not just restricted to same-sex parenting. When adults put their own needs, their own interests, their own demands, their own desires ahead of what is best for a child, and they leave that child in a situation where they are without a mother or a father, that itself is a form of abuse. It's abuse, for example, for a single parent to adopt a child when many other equally good two-parent homes are available. It's abuse for parents to divorce simply for reasons related to their own emotional happiness. It's abuse for LGBT couples to create children through IVF and then deprive them of a mother or a father. Later, every child has a mother and a father, and when that figure is missing, there is a narrative that is experienced as pain, loss, and at times shame. Normalization demands a kind of silence from multiple parties in a child's life. The child's lost biological parents must keep a distance or disappear to allow two gay adults to play the role of a parent. Extended family must avoid asking intrusive questions and shouldn't show any disapproval through facial expressions or gestures. Schools and community associations have to downplay their celebrations of fatherhood or motherhood, even canceling Father's Day and Mother's Day in favor of Parenting Day. And you got schools doing this all over the place. We can't have a Mother's Day. We can't have a Father's Day. We just have to have a Parenting Day. So kids in two same-sex parent households aren't going to feel bad. Does the silence, listen to this, does the silence of so many surrounding parties reverse the sense of loss? No. The child still feels the loss, but learns to remain silent about it because her loss has become a taboo, a site of repression rather than a site for healing and reconstruction. The abuse comes full circle. So let's see if there's anything else. This is a long piece, as I indicated. He writes here about talking with Dawn Stefanowicz. She's a Canadian woman who was raised by a gay father. And he says, in our heart-to-heart conversation, we both lamented that many children of same-sex couples will never speak openly about how unfair it was to be denied a mother or a father. Most kids of gay parents we know are struggling with sexual identity issues, recovering from emotional abuse, fighting drug addictions, or are so wounded by their childhood that they lack the stability to go public and face the onslaught from an increasingly totalitarian gay lobby which refuses to admit that there is anything wrong. And so he says, look, we as gays who grew up in same-sex households, we only count when we make gay people look good. If we're honest about our pain, honest about our loss, honest about our grief, we make gay people look bad, and therefore we are not allowed to speak. He says, we know that children have poorer life outcomes when they are raised outside a married biological parent household. So same-sex parenting is, as Robert Oscar Lopez says, a form of child abuse. Focal Point, AFR Talk.